So everyone, thanks for joining this. Thanks for joining Katherine Brodsky and I. This is Katherine and my first time hosting a discussion like this. And we're joined with Brian Krassenstein and Eric Kaufmann. So guys, thanks for joining us. And today we want to discuss Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. And we want to try to figure out who is more of a threat to democracy. And
there's a lot of there's a lot of chatter about, Trump is the greatest threat, but, people on the Trump side definitely view Harris as the biggest threat because, she's going to take us into communism. So, we want to have a pretty friendly debate / conversation and see if we can get closer to the truth. So just to start with, would love to have Eric and then Brian introduce themselves. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll start with some opening remarks. Eric.
Okay, yeah. My name's Eric Kaufmann. I'm a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, which is in Britain. I'm Canadian, actually, so I can't vote in the election.
Yeah, it's like, but you don't even have an English accent.
No. That's a bit about me. I've got a book out recently, which talks about essentially looking at the origins and impacts of woke. So that's the third awakening. And I've got a new course as well on that subject at the University of Buckingham. So I've done a whole bunch of other books and other things. I'm going to leave it at that.
I'll ask you this question because I know I get asked this a lot, and that's, as a Canadian, how dare you have an opinion about U.S. politics? And I'm a fellow Canadian, so how dare you have an opinion on U.S. politics? Why do you have one?
Well, everyone has an opinion on U.S. politics because it's covered so heavily, particularly in the Anglo countries. Britain and the U.S. Britain, Canada, there's always been a lot of coverage. I think in Britain, it's become even more. It's gotten more like Canada over the years, so that it's hard to tell. The American election seems to get more coverage almost than the UK one. But yeah, I think maybe you have a different perspective as being outside the American system, so you can compare it with things that are going on in Europe or going on in Canada. And I think there's some interesting things to observe there, which I'll try and bring in.
Sounds great. Brian, a quick introduction from you.
Yeah, so people know me from X. I have a degree in economics. I run several businesses throughout the media field, throughout the crypto field, going way back. I definitely lean more to the left. I live here in a red state, Florida, which is pretty far from Canada, I guess. Although a lot of Canadians come down here, in the winter. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much it.
I guess a follow-up question: why do so many people seem to hate you on this platform of X?
Well, so X definitely leans more to the right, and I think there's no denying that. Elon did that poll. It was like 3.5 to 1 Republican versus Democrat. So if you're political, it always gets heated. On X, it gets especially heated, especially if you're more on the left. On Threads, more loved and less hated, but I don't really use that app very much. If you're on the right, though, and you go to Threads, it's the opposite.
I started using Threads a little bit recently, like dipping my feet into the water. And it's basically the opposite of X, politically. I wrote something about, I think I asked if there are conservatives on there, and somebody responded, yeah, but they hide as they should. Something like that, right? So it's like they're polar opposites, which is very concerning because the more we divide in that way, right? We're dividing in terms of culture, we're dividing in terms of our how we interact on social media platforms, and that I think is causing people for things to get a lot more heated and for people to hate each other a lot more. So I think it's very important to have conversations where both sides participate in a way that's not, about hating each other, essentially. For the people who are listening on X, we're following this conversation. As we go along, feel free to put some questions for the speakers in the comment section, and I will eventually get to that and put some of them forward to the speakers. But I think our next question will be, who do you think, so we'll start with Eric, who do you think is the greatest threat to democracy and why?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to disappoint people. I'm not of the view that Harris is a bigger threat to democracy than Trump. So I would accept that, Trump, what he said about stealing the election, there's no question that he's more of a threat to democratic norms. But what I would say is just, I think that on the left, this is a sort of, while I accept that that's the case, I also think that there's an underestimating of the threat that Harris's support for a number of policies has in the long term in terms of eroding the basis of trust in institutions, which is necessary for a strong democracy. So even though she's not obviously telling the same kind of lies that Trump is telling and there's no January 6th, et cetera. But on the other hand, I think that when you are apparently giving support to rioters, for example, who are, clearly breaking the law, clearly damaging neighborhoods, or when you are not, when you're talking about deportation as something that is, you're chanting along with people who are anti-deportation. I mean, that is a major function of a government, is to police a border. I think this helps to kind of undermine the trust that maybe it's only half the country has in the established elite and established institutions, and that's very unhealthy for the democracy. And this is partly looking at this from Canada and from Europe, where many of the same things are going on and the same erosion of trust is occurring because of the immigration issue, because of some of these cultural issues. And I think there is a sort of an inability on the progressive side to understand that this is very serious and you have to take these issues extremely seriously, or a whole section of society will become alienated from the political class, from institutions, and so on.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question, because I think that Eric and Brian, you will have some agreement, perhaps. I think I want to just get to what I believe is a point of contention, which is that, Eric, you oppose Kamala Harris's view on wokeness and on immigration. And Brian, I don't know how you feel about wokeness and immigration as they relate to Kamala Harris's view. So what I'd like to kind of double click into specifically as it relates to Kamala Harris is, Eric, could you expand a bit on your view about wokeness and how is Kamala Harris handling wokeness? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think she's sort of, in a way, she was part of the Biden administration. And here I'm not drawing a distinction necessarily between Biden and Harris on this, but in a way, the promotion of the concept of equity, the idea of equal outcomes, rather than equal treatment, for example, the promotion of the attempt to clamp down on so-called disinformation and hate speech with nebulous definitions of those in such a way that might infringe on free speech in order to protect the so-called emotional safety of historically marginalized groups. And this emphasis on historically marginalized groups talking, and of course it bleeds into education with talking about critical race and gender ideology as well, which is not scientifically based, I would argue. This is something that's being promoted through diversity training and in the classroom. Now, granted, the states control education and so on, but the federal government has some powers in this area in terms of curriculum and in terms of funding for students and in terms of guidance for universities and schools. So I guess I just think that the emphasis on race, gender, and sexuality, centering those symbols and not the emphasis on class or on a sort of equal treatment based approach is very unpopular, number one. And I also think it undermines faith in institutions like universities, like schools. And I do think this is something that Harris and Biden have supported. Now, to her credit, Harris has kind of backed off a little bit on that, at least rhetorically. So I think that's good. Comparing to someone like Justin Trudeau in my country, she's not as radical as that. But on the other hand, I think it's still very divisive and negative. Now, and I also think it also has downstream effects, so that we can't separate woke from what's happening on the border. And the reason I'd say that is that if you consider deporting or calling somebody an illegal immigrant to be racism, which I don't think it is. And I don't think building a wall is racism either. But if you're going to call all of these things racist, you are effectively trying to silence and shut down people who disagree with some of these policies. And so in a way, you paint yourself into a corner where you almost have to dismantle the policies which you may need to control a border in the name of racial sensitivities. And I think there is a connection then between this idea of being hypersensitive on race issues to the point of talking about white privilege and systemic racism and these other very contested concepts, and not being able to control a border because you think deportation or restriction is somehow racist. In a way, by the way, that Obama didn't. And so we've seen this inability to control immigration, which is a big issue because the point is that there is a social contract in a way between government and the governed. And part of that contract is the idea that, okay, I pay half 45 or whatever the percentage is in the US in tax. I do that because I feel like I'm part of a community and I expect the government to do things in exchange for that tax revenue, in exchange for the placing trust in government. And one of those things is to secure a border. And it's worth saying that if the numbers that came in the US came in any country in Europe, people would be rioting in the streets. So it's worth just saying how exceptional the American situation is in this.
So essentially the border, would you say that's the main point of contention, or at least that's the point where it's the greatest threat to the country?
Well, I mean, is it not? I'm not sure what a threat it is to the country. I think it's more just that you are, in a way, violating a social contract with a lot of voters who would expect a normal state to be its function. And if it's not doing that job, then that sort of tears at the fabric of the democracy, I would argue. Now, maybe some voters may not care, and that's fine. But if it's framed as a social justice issue, that policing your border is unjust socially and no one's an illegal and you shouldn't deport, I just think that is sort of a violation of this kind of sacred social contract for a lot of voters, which undermines trust in the system. So I think it's not the same as saying the election is stolen when it wasn't, or, some of the stuff Trump does is more direct and more obviously a violation of democratic norms. But what I would say is this more indirect, seemingly innocuous, but it is really really undermines trust. And so does sort of, saying that everyone should, wear a mask and everything. And then suddenly in the BLM protests are out saying, oh, well, actually, no, go ahead and protest because this is really Trump's public safety. I think, again, there's an undermining of trust in the democracy. So that's what I guess there's where I would actually lend some credence to the argument on the other side, and to say, I think, and this is happening, by the way, European elites, Canadian elites are all getting that, I think they're all making this mistake. So it's not specific to the US, but I think it is probably the major reason for polarization and populism and the erosion of trust in elites. Yeah.
Brian, so I guess that, obviously there's a lot of people on your side of things who really literally view Trump as a threat to democracy. A lot of that, I imagine, would be around January 6th, but what are your thoughts on that? Why do you view him as a threat to democracy in the way that you do? And is any of it just hyperbole, or do you think it's a real thing?
I take the argument. I can understand some people's argument that he is a threat, but I don't think he's as big of a threat as president as perhaps running for president. I think what happened on January 6th should scare us because another election's coming up in 44 days, 45 days. If he was president, do I think all of a sudden we're going to be living in an authoritarian, government? No. I don't think we're just going to immediately be no longer a democracy. But I do think, and I think it's important that we do go back to January 6th and we see what happened. He was indicted in Georgia. He was indicted by the federal government for his actions on January 6th because those actions may have been a threat to democracy.
What are the specific actions? Because I think a lot of times people, they might think, well, January 6th was just this big riot. And what has Trump really done? He tweeted, go forward, protest peacefully. What is it that, that indictment that makes it, significant?
Yeah, I think there's several things. So number one, he pressured Mike Pence to try and use these false electors, these electors that weren't actual electors that represented the vote of the people. He wanted him to basically use these electors to undermine our democratic vote. He called on the Secretary of State of Georgia to find the votes. He repeatedly said that the election was stolen when he lost repeatedly in the courts, showing that the election wasn't stolen. He lost fair and square. He lost by 7 million popular votes. He lost across, I think he lost 5 more states than Biden. So I think that those actions and the actions that he's been indicted for are those actions in Georgia and by the federal government. I think those are, it's a pretty strong argument that he's at least charged with crimes that would be a threat to democracy. Whether he will be convicted or not, that's yet to be seen. And I don't want to convict him until a court says he's convicted. But I think that's enough to say that it's my opinion that he's a threat to democracy. But like I said earlier, I don't know if he was president for 4 years, right? Our democracy survived. People could argue that, hey, it almost didn't if Mike Pence were to accept those electors, and then it was to get through the courts and all the legal, the legal jargon that would have followed. Could he have undermined democracy and stayed in power? It's possible, but I do have faith in our institutions, the 3 branches of government. There's a reason why this country has lasted as long as it has through so much that we've seen in the past, through civil war, through the civil rights movement, through massive wars, right? So I don't want to sit here and say if Trump's elected, we're not going to be a democracy anymore. I don't think that's going to be the case. But I do think that these next 6-7 weeks, and then probably the 3 months after until the inauguration, if he does lose again, I think it could be scary. And I don't blame people for feeling a bit jittery about what could happen over the course of the next 5 months until January.
Well, there is this narrative that the election was stolen and the Democrats are going to steal again. And so Trump would win if it was not for the Democrats stealing the election. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, are you asking me or Eric?
I was asking you, but then Eric.
Oh, no, you go, Brian, you go.
Yeah.
You go.
So I mean, it's BS. I mean, he clearly lost in 2020. I mean, people are going to continue to say he didn't, but there's no evidence of it. There's been over 60 court cases. None of them showed that there was any widespread election meddling or voter fraud or anything like that. My guess is that if he loses in November, he's going to blame immigrants voting. You can kind of see that setup already coming out, where he's saying that immigrants are voting, and there isn't widespread evidence that any of that is actually happening.
Eric?
Well, I mean, I in a way, I agree with a lot of what Brian said, and so I don't back the kind of election was stolen stuff. I think, but there is a question here about, this is because I trust the courts, right? And again, this gets back to the importance of trust. So you have people who obviously don't trust the courts, and I think they're wrong. But obviously, none of us.
Right?
What's that?
You can look at both sides, right? The Supreme Court, the left is attacking the Supreme Court all the time. So go ahead.
Well, yeah, and of course you saw, during the Derek Chauvin verdict, people were clearly outside, making noise and actually putting pressure on that court. And I think it's worth saying that is also a threat to one branch of government now. And so I kind of think both sides are doing it. Obviously, Trump's more brazen, but on the other hand, so I think that's right. There is this question of trust, however. I mean, losing trust in institutions. And I think, Brian, you talked about the Supreme Court. The left trust as measured on surveys by Democrats in the Supreme Court has gone down. Trust in them by the Republicans in universities and the media is tanked. So each side is kind of losing trust in institutions it perceives to be captured by the other side. And there is a greater or lesser degree of truth in those claims. And so what that means is we get to a situation where the courts say, well, look, we've looked at the evidence and the election was not stolen and we can't find irregularities. That should be the end of it. But if you have this untrusting mentality, because none of us are there counting all those ballots, we have to kind of trust the intermediaries.
So how do you get past that? Because it's true what you're saying. There's so much distrust in the institutions. And so therefore, who is the arbiter of the truth, or how do we know that it's true or not?
Well, no, I think ultimately you have to trust in the courts. But that trust is a fragile thing. And that's why when I see, for example, the university systems, this is not just in the US and it's elsewhere, they are completely dominant. I'm a professor, I have been for 25 years. These departments, especially in the social sciences and humanities, are almost completely dominated by the left. It's like between 10 and 15 to 1, left to right. The universities are leaning into that. They are actually doing things like enacting diversity statements. They're enacting all kinds of things that actually are just accentuating that. Now, granted, there's been some walking back by a few Ivy League institutions on at least not making political statements in favor of BLM and other things. But the damage that I think there's an underestimating of the damage that sort of naked politicization, like schools teaching critical race and gender ideology, which is occurring in the U.S. case in about 95% of schools. I've run a survey of 18 to 20-year-olds, asking them about 8 different critical race and gender concepts, whether they've heard them in school. In Britain, it's 75%. So it's pretty much, these are unscientific, highly contested ideas that are basically being pushed in institutions through mandatory diversity statement, or it could be Pride Month, or it could be something else that is contentious and is they argue is not political. It is very political. That kind of thing undermines trust when you sort of have a masked man. And now I'm actually quite a supporter of of a lot of the lockdowns and MAC mandates. So I don't go for the sort of anti-vax thing. But what I would say is that when you suspend that for Black Lives Matter protests, the damage that does is enormous. So I don't think the progressive side in the institutions realizes what they're doing by allowing these institutions to become politicized. That undermines trust in them. And maybe that's true, maybe in the Supreme Court case, it's true in the other direction. But I'm just saying that's not taken seriously enough, certainly in the academic world where I am, and I don't think in the world of teaching and the world of journalism as well to some degree. So that's just a point that I would make with regard to the importance of trust and maintaining trust in things like courts, which is, of course, important. Yeah.
Well, Brian, I'm sorry.
I'll just follow up just on that one, is that in terms of the courts, because Trump has all these cases against him, as well as some where he was convicted. Democrats like to refer to him as a convicted felon. That seems to speak also to that lack of trust, because, if you're a Democrat, you're like, yeah, this is a convicted felon. The courts did their job. And if you're a Republican, you're basically saying, no, this was weaponized against, a political opponent. Is there kind of an answer here, Eric?
Well, I think there probably is some weaponization, but then, the problem is the guy doesn't do himself any favors. There is a lot of sleaze and there's a lot of corrupt behavior there. So, but of course there is also, weaponization, which is pretty bad as well. And this is the problem, is you got both of these things that are occurring, and, they're both contributing to the problem. But I just try and say, to the extent that responsible types of people in elite institutions, they are just not getting it, that you cannot lean into progressive politics and claim that's not political. That's not going to wash. And I just don't think that penny has dropped. They think this is moral, this is consensus values. We're going to call it anti-racism. So we're going to teach about something called systemic racism, which is not a scientific, measurable, falsifiable thing, or at least the work hasn't been done to do that. And it's just simply being pushed out there because, well, oh gosh, we've done wrong in the past, and there's white supremacy and white privilege, and you get Nicole Hannah-Jones getting the Pulitzer Prize. There's not a sense that what is the damage to institutions is being done by that. So, but equally, I'm not going to exonerate Trump and his behavior, which, I do get it. I mean, he's certainly not helping himself.
I have a question for Brian, if I can jump in for 1 second. So, Brian, Eric just said a lot about his views of the progressive movements, BLM, systemic racism, and progressive movements around those. Do you agree with Eric's characterization that these progressive movements are damaging or harmful? Or how do you feel about, do you agree or disagree with Eric about the impact of those progressive movements?
So I think the right makes a lot about small things. They blow things out of proportion. Do I think that there are elements within the left, especially the extreme parts of the left, who take things over the top? Absolutely. I think also when it comes to wokeness, if you want to call it that, I do think the left can take things to an extreme, but I also feel that the right focuses on these issues, these hot button issues that don't really impact as many people to the extent that they want them to think it does. And they focus on this rather than actual things that could be helping the country. And you have all these social fights and these culture wars rather than Americans really arguing over what matters the most. And I don't really think anti-woke and woke is really what matters to most people. I think that elements on the right make it seem like they do. But in actuality, if you go talking to people, like how many people are actually affected by, like transgender issues? Like I think I know like 3 transgender people, and, like it's not bothering me. It shouldn't bother my kids. They never had any issues with them. So like, I think both sides are to blame on this. I think that the right focuses on the extremes that some people on the left try and put out there. But in actuality, it's most people aren't acting that way, and most people don't really care as much as the right wants them to think they do.
Eric, agree or disagree?
Well, there's some I agree with and some I disagree. I mean, you're right that culture wars is not a top issue for voters. It occasionally becomes an issue, like in Virginia, it was an issue around critical race in schools. But what I'd say is this, and that is, you're right about, say, there's only a small number of transgender individuals. But for example, if you do surveys of the American public, if you take people under 50, about 40 to 50% say they are worried about losing their job or reputation for things they might post on social media or things that in the future or in the past. So there is a significant level of worry amongst people in the workforce, for example. We have, anyone in an organization over 1,000 is significantly likely to undergo diversity training where a lot of these concepts are introduced. Now, again, you can tune out, you can try and sort of tune out, but there is a sense in which this is actually there's a violation of your freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. And in terms of the schools, this is there in the vast majority of pupils are getting exposed to these very radical ideas talking about. Now, you can talk about the U.S. as being built on stolen land and, as a racist country. I think that's a mistake. I mean, you can talk about the U.S. being built on stolen land, but I don't think that you should be able to do that without talking about the fact every country is built on stolen land. And so it's really a question of comparing one settler colonial regime against another and saying, well, is this, because history is about settler colonialism, is this one worse than that one? And so I don't think there's that proportionality in the education system. And the other thing I'd say is, the culture war, first of all, what we have is, I think, a cultural revolution in the institutions, and resisting that cultural revolution is being called culture war. I don't think that's what it is. And the other thing is, I think it has a downstream effect on these issues that you're right, Brian, that the issues people really care about. Let's just take a few of them. And crime, the border, education are all affected. Military recruitment. These are all things that I would argue are affected by woke. So if you, for example, if people who are in jail or who are being excluded from class are disproportionately black, that's seen as a disparate impact and therefore systemically racist, then you can't enforce discipline in a class and you can't actually do optimal policies to reduce crime because those are ruled immediately as systemically racist. So all of a sudden, you're not going to be able to have an optimal education or crime prevention system. And so actually, and when it comes to the border, likewise, if you want to deport and you want to have stronger border policies or remain in Mexico or other policies, and those are accused of being systemically racist, then you can't, it shuts down that debate. So what I would say is, even though woke itself is perhaps more something that is talked about on Twitter or amongst elites, the ramifications of those speech restrictions and the way they frame debates are very real and have very real downstream effects on a lot of these more concrete issues, which I think are really what's driving a lot of the polarization, actually. Because if you look, I'm a political scientist, a lot of Western publics, what we see is a shift in the axis of politics from economic left-right to cultural questions, whether we call it globalist, nationalist, open, closed, whatever. And these cultural issues are really what provide a lot of the fuel behind populist right movements in Europe, behind Trump. And then once you've got this basis of support on the basis of these cultural issues, then you can start throwing in the crazy stuff as well, which we've talked about. You know, the election was stolen and everything's a conspiracy, right? So my worry is that without addressing these cultural questions, that is simply going to provide fuel for these movements, which are then going to go in various crazy directions, including like a January 6th. So I think these are vital, and I just don't see a willingness on the progressive side on the left to really grapple with that. Now, I mean, there's plenty of good people. A lot of them are silent. Like in academia, amongst leading social scientists, 2 out of 3 support mandatory diversity statements. So this isn't just a fringe group of people. These are essentially McCarthyite political litmus tests that you're forced to sign up to in order to get a grant, in order to get a job. Now, it's not, I think Canada's worse than the U.S. in this regard, but actually, the U.S. there's more of a debate. But still, this is a violation of freedom of conscience. It is a McCarthyite political litmus test, and yet most academics are actually fine with that. They're cool with that because it's got a nice label that says diversity inclusion on it, and they're not going to oppose that. So I don't think it's just the fringe. I think there was a significant group, and I point that out in my book, of left liberals that are going along with this, partly because they believe it. They kind of think it's the nice thing to do and the just thing to do, but it's really not. It's very divisive, and I think that there needs to be more of an appraisal of that.
Is this the path to communism? Like people say that, some people say that Harris is a communist?
Well, I think that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, so this is where, but the problem is if you break trust on some issues like woke and the border, then that opens people up to believing a lot of stuff that's more out there. Like, so yeah, no, I mean, a communist would be in favor of 100% taxation. And I think that's ridiculous. But I would certainly say, I don't think she's walked back a lot of claims around defund the police, around some of these things that are deeply unpopular with most Americans. Yeah.
Seems very difficult that once your side commits to some ideas to walk them back. It's like once they're being implemented in particular, it's just that much harder to do that.
Yeah, and maybe it's politically unwise. I don't know. I mean, but I don't know. I think if there was some sense of, if she said, I've changed my mind. Now, but again, will the activists in the Democratic Party allow her to do that? Like, for example, if you take Obama's border policies, would the Democratic activists and donor class would they have allowed Biden? Will they allow Harris to do what Obama did? Or will they?
I think that, like, in politics, you have this it's almost taboo to go back on something you said, even if it was like 5 or 6 years ago. And you see this on both sides. And Harris has changed stances on several things, and she's taken so much heat from the right for doing so. So I think as Americans, I think we need to stop making that taboo. I think we should embrace it when a politician changes their view, if they have a good reason why they change their view. If it's somebody that's keeping the same views for decades and decades and not changing them, I think that's a bigger problem than somebody changing their views as, we progress and technologies change and societies change. So I think that's important. Harris, I don't think she ever supported defund the police. She did want to set up funding for police as well as for specialists in, like family matters and specialists in a variety of issues. I don't think she ever said defund the police. You can check me on that. I don't think she has.
Well, I think in the context of rioting that's, gutting city centers and the depolicing that led to thousands, I would argue very clearly that the Ferguson effect style depolicing, which has led to thousands of people killed. I mean, I think that she was, I think it was incredibly irresponsible to essentially give support to the people doing that and saying people should support movements to sort of fund their, calling it a movement and not calling it a riot. And I just think that, she did talk about reducing police budgets. Now, look, we can have a conversation about police budgets, but I think at the time when this sort of movement, very aggressively rioting, was going on, I think to send out the signal she did was I think very irresponsible. So, even though she may not have come out and said defund, it was pretty bad, I thought.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of talk of, she paid the bail for rioters and all that. And what she did was she was working with an organization, and she recommended that people donate to the organization because lots of people were arrested who weren't rioting. Lots of people were arrested for protesting. And she said, hey, donate to this bond fund, because one of the biggest issues, and this is particularly strong among people who are less well off, is that they can't afford their bond. So they end up staying in a jail cell for weeks or months until a trial date. Her point is, why should people not be able to get out on bond just because they don't have money? And she recommended people donate to this fund. And the fund then ended up bailing a rioter out. So I think like people overreact on that. People try and skew what actually happened there, and what her intent was. But yeah, I mean, that's like anything in politics.
Right. But I think the context is important. I mean, if she had said, defund is, we shouldn't be attacking the police. If she was really supportive of the police, but also supportive of these people, which, makes a good case, right? If they're being thrown in jail or can't afford bail, that's fair. But what you didn't hear was, criticism of this kind of activity, the rioting and the attacks on the police. And that's where it just looks really bad. So that's what I would say is, now, maybe she's changed her mind. And I think she's not an ideologue like Justin Trudeau. And so I will give her that. But I think, unfortunately, I think she made some mistakes. Now, whether that's going to matter in this election, I don't know. But
I just find it, like hard for Americans to use that against her. She was a career prosecutor, like she's locked up plenty of people. She gets criticism for locking up too many people, and then she gets criticism for not being strong enough on crime. It's kind of like she can't win no matter what.
I'm curious.
Yeah. Is that a paradox? Is that a paradox, Eric? That she locks up too many people and not enough?
No. Look, I think she went through different phases, and the conditions were different in the earlier phase in California. But I think she was caught up in, I will call it a moral panic that occurred around George Floyd. And I think she was, in a way, echoing that. And in a way, I see her as, she's probably come out of that now. Yeah, probably. But I do think she was caught up in the mood, and I think she supported the mood. at least she's backpedaled on some of it. Justin Trudeau, for example, in Canada, has done, in my view, equally terrible things around the so-called mass graves, which is a complete hoax. But he sort of fueled a lot of arson and church burning and all kinds of stuff and hasn't walked it back. So he's much worse, definitely. But I would say, in the case of Harris, that there is no question she was part of that move. Whereas Biden, I think, was quite clear about criticizing defund more robustly, whereas I don't think Harris was. But you can't change the past. Fair enough. Yeah, I understand that.
Are both of you concerned, so if Harris wins, you're going to have a group of people who are going to say the election was stolen. If Trump wins, I don't know. So can we kind of explore the outcomes for each? And, does it present any kind of danger?
So I personally, if Trump wins, I'm not going to say that he cheated or, Republicans rigged it or anything like that. I do think the opposite will happen though. And I can't speak for everybody else on the left. I'm sure there's going to be some people. I mean, with Hillary Clinton, people said that, Russia hacked the voting machines and all that. But I personally feel that it's going to be more skewed to the right, where if Trump loses, the right is going to, do another 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I think I unfortunately agree with Brian on that. Yeah, I mean,
you're not supposed to do that.
I know I'm not supposed to do that. I mean, I really wish that, Trump focused on the core issues and not these sort of personal psychodramas and trying to contest the election. And it just looks pathetic in a way, if that doing that anyway. And I think, unfortunately, this is where perhaps the left's critique is right. There is a sort of cult around Trump as a figure, and he they kind of back up whatever stream of consciousness he's saying. But but I think if you were to scrape that away, the problem is there are real issues that he's channeling and I think that there are powerful issues that actually explain a lot of his popularity under the surface, and that I think that the progressive left elites that are in the institutions and that back, the Democrats now, and I support a lot. I mean, I'm torn because I support a lot of Democrats' policy on things like Ukraine and climate change and various other things. But I just think the cultural side, this idea that, diversity is our strength and that everything's about racism, white supremacy. I mean, I just think that there are many, many problems with this idea, and that my worry is this. Okay, my worry with Harris getting in. I mean, in some ways there'll be different worries with Trump getting in. The worries with Harris getting in is that, in a way, the message will be, oh, well, actually, we weren't punished for essentially losing control of the border and essentially going pretty crazy on a lot of the identity politics stuff. So actually, why don't we just keep going business as usual, and we can always kind of get out of it. And this is just going to build up pressure in the system. So that's my worry. But obviously, with Trump getting in there, I would have other worries. But
there's a lot of fear in terms of Trump getting in, because as I mentioned, I dabbled on Threads the other day, and I had this whole argument with somebody who was saying that Trump. So they kind of took the logical leap from Trump deporting people or putting illegal immigrants into camps or containment areas. Kind of went from that to, well, the next logical leap was that he's going to put people in that disagree with him, in prison. And I've even had that conversation with a very, very smart friend of mine who has the same kind of view, where he thinks that if Trump could get away with it, he would put, all the Hispanic people, for example, in prison. Brian, how realistic do you think that is? And where is that kind of thinking coming from?
Well, I think if that was the case, I'll probably be going to jail soon here. No,
we're all in Twitter jail anyway.
That's not actually a concern of mine. Like, I do think that the institutions, the judicial branch of government will hold up. It's not going to just allow people to be thrown in prison for, being a critic of Trump. I think the bigger concern for me, and I think a lot of people on the left who I think actually understand how government works, is more so what it could spawn from, just people within the populace attacking people outside that who do criticize Trump. Like they might feel this is an opening to do something, horrible. I think that's a bigger concern than actually Trump instructing the FBI or, whoever, to arrest people who are speaking out against him and then expecting a court and a jury to actually convict that person. That's not going to happen. That shouldn't even be in the realm of, possible discussion, because, in the United States, that doesn't happen. Maybe if we continue down a specific trajectory where a Trump-like figure was president for the next 40 years and appointed judicial, judges throughout the courts and the Supreme Court, then maybe you could get to that point. But nowhere in the near future is something like that.
The nice thing is that you guys have a statute of limitations, which I very strongly believe in. But in terms of like the discourse around Trump, there's just, it does tend to be very emotional. Like there are logical, factual reasons why one might have a problem with Trump, not support him, think he's a terrible candidate, or, even in some ways think that he's a threat to democracy. For example, January 6th would be an example of that. But Eric, why do you think there is that level of emotional thinking from the left when it comes to Trump?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to say, I actually think, if their criticism is that he's trampling over the norms of democracy, which are hard fought, we fought for many centuries, and you shouldn't be questioning the results of elections like that. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's right. However, I actually believe that the sacredness around race, around sexuality, around, race, sexuality, and gender are a major driver, particularly of the elite intellectual left. And so I almost think they're more worked up about Trump, building a wall or talking about immigrants or doing a Muslim ban or whatever, or the stuff around abortion, or I think it's anything that touches on race, gender, sexuality, that is touching on religion for significant numbers of. This is not the sensible center left, but people in the radical fringes of academia, but also a lot of the activists. And so I think that just makes them see red, because they sort of think these things should be sacred and you should never talk that way about, immigrants or the border or what. And of course, Trump does go overboard. He does shade definitely into racist statements. But most of the time, I think certainly talking about building a wall, to my mind, that should not be imbued with the kind of symbolic significance it has.
Do you think it's the rhetoric? Because, for example, I'm an immigrant, and I've talked for many years about, I don't believe in illegal immigration, for example. I'm on the left. I don't believe in illegal immigration. I think a lot of people that I know on the left don't either. But when you frame it in certain ways, it becomes an issue that now sounds like racism, as opposed to just having a sensible immigration policy.
Right. But I guess a lot of this debate is around the elasticity of the term racism, which is used to shut down and smear and cancel, right? And so that card is played far too often. You don't give people the benefit of the doubt, and it's played where it doesn't apply. I mean, it is a simple state security matter that if the wall works to actually limit illegal entry, it's worth building, or at least looking into building a wall. But it's framed as this thing like, it's white people turning their back on the world, and it's kind of racism, and it always comes back to that racist charge. And I think that is, again, one of the most poisonous things that occurs, is the stretching and inflation and overuse of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And so I just think this generates a lot of resentment, and it also has these downstream ripple effects. And I think one of the reasons for this emotional reaction to Trump. Now, if the emotional reaction to Trump is that he's he's violating democratic norm. That I understand, right? I mean, that he has done. He's sleazy. He's, being involved in corruption and all that. So that I totally get. But I worry that one of the reasons that you have had this enormous irrational reaction is not so much that threat to the tradition of liberal democracy as towards, he's violating the sacred values around identity. And, that is really unacceptable. And so I think this is this quick move to always talking about racism all the time. That's the most, for example, when you question ballot counting in Detroit, granted that these are mainly black districts in Detroit, but maybe the Republicans are just concerned, I think they're wrong, but maybe they're just concerned about the partisan disadvantage that could come up. But of course, the first thing that comes out is, new Jim Crow, this is racism, is always the first thing that comes out of their mouths, because that's what seems to be sacred. And I think that's what drives a lot of the emotional energy. But of course, there is some risks there. I mean, Trump, I don't think he would defy a court. I don't think necessarily, people are going to break laws for him. So I'm relatively with Brian. I think the system will hold up, but I think it's also pretty bad to essentially trample on these norms, which are important for maintaining a democracy. And let's face it, only a minority of the world's people are living in democracy. So this is an achievement. And so I think those criticisms are well placed, but I think the emotion in this, unfortunately, I think comes more from what I would call woke, the making sacred of historically marginalized groups. I think that's really the energy behind this.
Brian, do you agree with that? Eric saying that the sacredness, as he says, around race, gender, and sexuality is a big, big problem. Do you agree?
I don't think it's as big as he's making it out to be. I think that what happened with the whole border thing and immigration and the wall, I don't think it was so much about race as about politics. So Trump comes down that elevator in 2016 and immediately says immigrants are rapists, they're murderers, and some of them might be good people, right? Immediately that sparked the left to defend immigrants, and then it became this huge political issue. Then he started saying, I want to build a wall. I want to build a wall from the Pacific to the Caribbean Sea, right? Or the Gulf, right? And that forced the left to attack the wall. Even if some of them thought, hey, well, the wall might make sense in at least some areas where like strategically it could prevent immigrants from coming in and funnel them into ports of entry. But no, they were just like, we're against the wall. And it became this huge issue. And I honestly don't think having sections of wall or fencing along the border is a bad idea. I think if you were just going to build a wall from sea to sea and not deal with all the possible ramifications with property rights and with, geological barriers, I think that would be irresponsible. But like I said, I think the left turned against it, not because of race particularly, but because it became such a politicized issue when Trump started speaking out against immigrants as rapists and murderers, and some of them being good people. It just pushed their hand. And just like we're seeing this election cycle, immigration is a huge political talking point. And it's a hot button issue and a divisive issue. But if both sides actually got together and they work together and they compromise, like, we could have a solution. It's not going to be perfect. If we could come up with a perfect solution, we would have done this 50 years ago. Every election, we're talking about immigration, but it's the problem that both sides are using it for their own political gain and not wanting the other side to get a political victory. That's why there's no solutions. And just like the wall didn't get done because of the election and because of rhetoric around it, the same thing's happening now where, yeah, we had a bipartisan bill and Republicans ended up voting it down because Trump didn't want Biden to get the win. So I think it's both, like both sides are equally to blame here. And I think that we can find a solution, and it doesn't have to be about race. It can just be about security in the country, about being fair, actually allowing actual asylum seekers to come in, while we can somehow weed out the bad players who are trying to pretend they're asylum seekers.
Well, I do think an accommodation is possible, but I think that the Democrats, or I don't think that there is an understanding of how actually egregious it is to essentially allow people who are coming from countries that are not really, these are not countries for the most part that are in the grip of civil war. And even if they are in the grip of civil war, it's not clear, there's 60 million refugees in the world.
It's more violence, though. Violence, rape, gangs. It's more like that than civil war.
Yeah, but there's a lot of countries in the world, there's regions of countries in the world that are safe. I mean, they could go to Costa Rica, they could go to Mexico, they could go a whole bunch of places. But they want to come to the United States, and they want to come there because it's a rich country and there's a lot of job opportunity. And I'm afraid I am not a believer that most of these are refugees. I mean, I think they come from countries that things aren't great in. Absolutely. They may have high crime and gangs. That shouldn't mean they get the right to settle in a rich country like the United States. The point I'm trying to make is that the government of the United States should be looking out for the interests of the people of the United States. Now, of course, there are obligations to genuine refugees, but those obligations need to be distributed across many countries in the world, not just rich ones where you can have a nice life. And so I think there is this narrative around, and I agree. If I were in the shoes of these people coming across the border, I'd do the same thing. So it's not criticism of them, but actually for the government not to actually enforce the border properly. I think they're underestimating the seriousness of that. And there's in a way, if you look at the history of the border, it's actually, you can make the argument that there has not been enough attention placed on that, not just in this administration, but over successive Republican and Democratic administrations. I mean, one of the reasons Trump gets in the first place in 2015-16 is because previous Republican administrations had, along with the Democrats, been very lax on this issue. And I think we're underestimating the importance of this issue. And I also think
they've been so lax on that, Eric?
Because there are strong commercial interests on the right, and then we're strong progressive interests on the left, ideologically, that came together and formed a coalition. And essentially, this, along with the immigration lobbyists, their interest was to keep this thing, not wide open, but relatively open.
What are those interests more specifically?
Well, agricultural interests, for example, on the business side, the business interests have been long been in favor of cheap labor. On the progressive side, it's a cultural left kind of, cosmopolitan open borders philosophy. That's been a big part of progressivism since the New Left in the 60s. So these two movements together have made it very difficult. And eventually enough voters got fed up enough that Trump tapped into that and won the Republican primary. So there was an internal battle within the Republican Party. He was able to win that battle by tapping into the very real frustrations of a lot of voters that this was not being addressed. And all that the Republican Party wanted to talk about was low tax and military adventures. So I think there was an internal revolution within the Republican Party. And this is reflecting a lot of what's going on in other countries in the West, where this is also an upheaval that's realigning politics around the immigration issue. And I think just thinking more sensitively about voters who, and culture is going to be part of this, like we see it in the Springfield, Ohio thing. It is not racist to not want your community to change rapidly like that. And I think, again, there's this very quick, now it is racist when Trump says, these are all pet eaters or they're a bunch of rapists. So I would agree with that critique, and it should be talked about more sensitively. But on the other hand, I think you should be able to talk about pace of ethnocultural change without being accused of racism. And yes, if immigrants are predominantly from another group than whites in America, then whites actually probably have a demographic, those who identify with their group probably have a demographic interest in slowing that down to allow assimilation to occur. Yeah, that is currently outside, I would argue, outside the Overton window of possible debate. And I think this is probably one of the problems, is there are all these proxy things that are occurring. So we have proxies around, they're eating pets or they're rapists or whatever. But I think it's ducking what is an issue. And these are issues that in all Western countries they are roiling the politics across all Western countries.
It seems like there's a lot of conflation where you'll take, because there are groups, including people I've talked to who are pretty prominent conservatives, where they really do believe in zero immigration, including legal immigration, or very, very limited, only, stellar kind of people. And they do have the motivation of, look, they see themselves as an ethnically, or America as an ethnically white country. And therefore that is part of it for them. And it's also sort of this America First idea. And then there are people who have just full on racist. And then there are people who just want to limit immigration because culture, when you have a lot of people coming in very quickly who are not adjusting to the culture, it can create problems. So, but all of those categories, I feel like, get thrown together. And then on the left, I think they just see that all of them equally racist, basically.
Right, and which of course is a social taboo in American society. So it's a very effective thing but I think it actually really distorts the debate, right? Because I think actually, okay, I don't think the number of people who say America's a white country, I mean, you'd have to be blind to make that kind of a claim anyway in today's day and age. But I think the argument
is it as the ground, like it was originally a white country. They don't particularly like that it has evolved as much as it has.
Right.
Whereas I was like, oh, it's a country of immigrants. Like, well, no, that's false.
Right. But I think that that's a reasonable position to take, in the sense that not that it's always been a white country, because clearly it hasn't been. But on the other hand, to say, well, it's had a certain ethnic composition. Now that's changed, obviously. You've got an increase in Hispanic and Asian, whatever. But maybe the argument is, well, and in fact, if you look at survey data, it's not just whites, but there are many Hispanics and Asians too who are attached to that the ethnic composition of the United States that they knew is part of their national identity. So it's not like everybody's white. It's all about, so there's a certain mix, and it might be 60, 40 or whatever the heck it is, but they may not want it to flip over to become, let's say, something in the other direction. And I think that is not the same thing as saying this is a white country and you got to be white to be an American. And often the academic left will sandwich those positions together so that anyone who's uncomfortable with the pace of change, oh, you're closed and you're not an open person. So we've only got two conditions. You're either open or closed. One of my arguments is we got to get to a position where we could talk about, some people want it faster, some people want it slower, including zero. And we're going to meet in the middle. But right now we can't have that conversation, because anyone who wants it slower is called a nativist and a racist. And I think that's a problem. So what we got is the Republicans don't know how to make these arguments, or they're not seen as legitimate. And so you get all these proxies coming in like, oh, well, they're taking jobs, they're putting pressure on, or it's crime, or it's pets, or whatever. But really, I think the real issue, and you can see this in the experimental and academic survey data, is that it's these cultural concerns that are really driving it. And I would like to see that an open debate had on that, where the left would not just jump to the race card immediately. And we could then say, okay, well, look, you guys want it slower and maybe someone else wants it faster, so we're going to go in the middle. I think that would take a lot of the heat out of it. But I think as long as we're playing this game of shutting things down as racist, that will just lead to misunderstandings.
It also has made it so that people will now claim that there is no racism, because everybody's just calling random things racist. It's true that they are calling things that don't deserve that label racist, but it doesn't also. But at the same time, it's not like racism has fully disappeared either. We live, I think, in a much better society in that regard. It has improved tremendously, but is it completely gone? It probably will never. I don't think that's ever going to disappear, because that's how people react to differences, and they like having groups and disliking certain groups, and, scapegoating some groups.
Well, the other thing about it is too, like, people who haven't achieved status, have a career, maybe their identity's tied more to profession and career, whereas somebody who doesn't have a lot of achievements, they're more likely to identify with ascribed identities around nation, religion, ethnicity, and so on. And I think that has to be accepted more, that some people just aren't as successful, perhaps, in achieving a status. And so there is going to be a class dimension, although I think that's greatly overplayed. But I think that there has to be an acceptance that some people see change as loss, some people see diversity as disorderly, and that's partly heritable. It's like a third to a half heritable. There has to be a place for those people in a society. You cannot just say those people are narrow-minded nativist bigots and we're going to just freeze them out because they just have to shut up. I think that strategy, which is still kind of the strategy that a lot of the left want to pursue, at least the academic left that I come into contact with, I just think that's just not working, and something else has to be tried. It's not working in Europe, and I don't think it's working in the U.S.
Jake?
So, where do we stand on time here, guys? I didn't set a strict.
I think we're coming up to the hour, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Catherine, sorry, I know we're live, but for those watching, this is our first time, so forgive us if we're rough around the edges here. But, Catherine, should we wrap up?
Yeah, if we wanted to, maybe some final thoughts on how you see the outcome of this.
Yeah, if we're going to go with one final question, and then we can wrap up, because whoever is, I think at least two of you guys are East Coast time. It's getting kind of late over there. So what? I mean, I have a question I can ask, and Catherine, sure. So, what do you think that most people are getting wrong when they're assessing Trump versus Harris? What do you think their fallacy is that they're making?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
No, you go, Brian. You go.
I was just going to say that I think it might not necessarily be Harris versus Trump, but I think that a lot of people are looking at past elections and polling and expecting the same outcomes. So I mean, like, Trump was down in polls in 2016, and then he ended up winning by decent margins over Clinton. Last election was pretty tight, even though Biden was up significantly. You can't really go by polls. The polls adjust, they adjust from election cycle to election cycle. If they got them wrong 4 years ago or 2 years ago, they're going to make a change and try and get them right. So you can't really focus on that. I think for each candidate individually, I think number one, Trump, I think if he does win, he's not going to, like I said, he's not going to undermine democracy. He was already president once. Biggest concern is just the election and getting past the election inauguration. I think with Harris, I think they're underestimating how much she's her own person. They're over-connecting her to Biden. Now, if you recall the debates in 2020, the Democratic primary debates, she differed from Biden quite substantially on a number of issues, and we don't have time to go into all that. But she is her own person, and I think she's going to forge her own path. She's been a vice president for Biden. The vice president's duty is to basically support the president. She's not making policy. She might have Biden's ear. She might be able to give suggestions, but Biden's making those final calls, and he's the president. Now, when she's president, she's going to be able to make her own decisions and forge her own policies and create her own path ahead. So I think that, and I think Republicans are doing this because it's the easy way to attack her. They don't know a ton about her, and there isn't an easy path to attack her. So linking her to Biden allows them to attack her on all of Biden's shortcomings. But I don't think she's anything like Biden.
Yeah. What I'd say, just a couple of things. One is that in terms of the polls, there've been what these polls do is there's only a 2.5% response rate, so they're kind of weighting by all kinds of factors. And I think there's a potential for a polling miss. I still think probably it'll be a polling miss that they're missing certain Trump voters who don't trust pollsters. But I think that's been overcome to some degree. But one of the things I think that is important, this more gradual, is the shift of minority voters every election since 2008, a few points towards the Republican Party. And I think that this reflects a whole bunch of things. I mean, one is for African Americans moving out of their traditional core areas, urban areas where they are more under the influence of the community and the church. And it's harder for them to dissent. The second thing is the Hispanic. What we know from the data is that the more established, so third generation Hispanics are more Republican than second than first. And I think, therefore, there is this drift, which might only be a point or 2 points. But I think that's actually quite important on a very finely balanced contest. So one possibility, I think, is that minority voters, who are the ones who are perhaps more biddable and less fixed in their partisanship, they could be an important factor. And I think there's a chance they could be important for Trump. And that could be the story. Now, I could be wrong on that, but there's no question that since 2008, they've only been moving in one direction. So I don't know. And the second thing I would say is, if Harris gets in, one of the things is that in the West right now, left-wing parties are doing badly as a rule, and many of them have had their worst results in Europe since the war. The exceptions being some of the Scandinavian ones where they've actually taken a more conservative line on culture and immigration. But right now in Britain, for example, the recently elected left-wing party, which really came in on only about 30% of the vote was split in various ways, and their popularity has been nosediving. The same thing happened to the German SPD, Olaf Scholz. Very soon after getting elected, the popularity just tanked. And I think there's a risk because I think, again, and I think it speaks to some of these issues around culture and around trust that I think are quite powerful. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a risk that any party is going to have a short honeymoon. But what's been happening in Germany and Britain, the essentially British Labour Party had about a 1 week honeymoon, and they are now as unpopular in many ways as the predecessors were. So it's something to think about. It's perhaps not so easy to govern as a leftist, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe Harris will pick up on a rising economic mood and it'll be fine. But I don't know. I think that the record of left-wing parties across the West is they seem to be struggling right now. So that's just something to bear in mind.
Right. Well, thanks to the three of you guys. Let me end the recording, and then perhaps the four of us could wrap up for a moment.
Okay. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
We didn't fight very much, which is unfortunate.
We
needed blood.
I know.
I don't know if, by the way, I don't know if it's still live or not. I clicked stop, but
still live.
Is it? Okay. Yeah. We got along.
We got along. This is a terrible thing.
You need a red-blooded MAGA to come in.
Well, we could have had a argument about, the bad rhetoric that, is getting Trump killed.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really interesting topic, actually, because it actually speaks to ultimately freedom of speech in some ways, because, not just freedom of speech, because for years there's been that debate, do violent movies cause people to commit acts of violence, and does speech and is hate speech, causing violent outcomes. So it's interesting because I'm noticing like the same people who are like very pro freedom of speech, are like, well, we need to it's the left's fault because of the rhetoric. But it's interesting because those two things, it presents an interesting debate, I think.
You're right. That's inconsistent. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
So I think those claims are usually overblown about speech harms. And I think it's as true for the Trump stuff.
Well, the difficulty with all of that, even if you could say, well, maybe sometimes certain kind of speech does lead to bad outcomes, because you can make that case. The thing is, which speech,